A lone wagon rattles across the sweeping plains, clouds of dust kicked high into an orange-streaked sky. The young woman inside winces at every jolt, one hand pressed gently over the baby, growing within her. Her husband is gone lost to a brutal accident days before. Fear claws at her heart, but she refuses to crumble. Little does she know, a day of betrayal and hardship looms ahead, one that will cast her into the endless wilderness with nothing but a broken spirit and a fierce will to survive. And amid the desolation, a Shawnee warrior waits, bound by fate, to change her life forever. Charlotte Greenway never imagined she would set out on the Oregon Trail alone. It was 1851, and she was barely 20 years old, newly married to an eager pioneer named Thomas. The promise of new land and prosperity had drawn them away from their simple life in Independence, Missouri. Their wagons lined the muddy streets and open lots every spring each day, bringing more travelers, more ambition, more dreams. The lure of unclaimed territories of farmland, so rich it promised a lifetime's harvest, was too strong to resist. From the outset, their journey had been plagued by small tragedies. Oxen went lame, supplies ran short, and wagon wheels cracked under the relentless weight of precious heirlooms and farm tools. Storms lashed the plains with sudden fury, and thirst parched every throat when the dusty summer heat replaced the spring rains. People vanished in the night, lost or, more grimly, taken by misfortune. And yet the travelers pressed on, driven by hope, and for most a need to outrun the life they left behind. For Charlotte, a glimmer of new life accompanied the promise of land she was carrying Thomas's child, conceived not long after their wedding. Though her belly was only just beginning to show, it shimmered with possibility and the weight of tremendous responsibility. Each morning, Thomas would speak to that unborn child, telling the stories of the new farm. They would build a sturdy log cabin by a riverbank, tall fences for the livestock, neat rows of corn and wheat. Every night, before drifting into an uneasy sleep beneath the wagon's canvas canopy, Charlotte imagined how their child would run free across open fields under an endless sky. But no one could predict how swiftly dreams could shatter. By the time they reached a boulder-strewn crossing of the Platte River, the wagon party was ragged with exhaustion. The river's currents swirled fast, foaming around the stones. Wagons inched across precariously, each driver praying that their team wouldn't lose footing. It was here tragedy struck while trying to wrestle a stubborn mule back into line. Thomas was knocked off balance. He tumbled beneath the heavy wagon wheels, never to rise again. The entire party stood stunned as Charlotte cradled her husband's broken body, tears staining the dusty ground. It all happened too fast. The realization that the man who had been her shelter and her hope lay silent. The wagon party's leader, a bearded ex-army officer named Gideon Garrett, spoke words of condolence, but his eyes were cold as stone. They had no time for extended mourning. The crossing was dangerous, and all around them the wide Nebraska sky warned of gathering storms. They buried Thomas on the nearest patch of high ground, under the shade of a lone cottonwood that stood sentinel by the shore. Charlotte, numb with grief, prayed quietly for her husband's soul, while the others uttered hushed sympathy. Little did she know her own sorrows were only beginning. In the days following Thomas's burial, Charlotte tried to contribute to the wagon train. She still had her trunk of spare clothing and a small stash of dried goods. But her sadness weighed heavily, and the men who had once been polite to Thomas's wife now saw her as a burden. A few wives offered quiet empathy, but no one dared speak too strongly in her defense when Gideon decided she slowed their progress. The leader's motivations were practical, or so he claimed. She was pregnant alone and had little to offer in return for the risk of feeding and protecting her. The unspoken truth was that Gideon simply had no tolerance for what he saw as weakness. The wagon train had become more like a forced march, and Gideon wanted no one to hinder his breakneck pace toward a rumored gold strike in the mountains farther west. At first, Charlotte refused to believe any talk of abandonment. It was unthinkable leaving a woman carrying a child to fend for herself in the unforgiving wilderness. But whispers traveled along the wagon's rumors of Gideon's plan. Late one evening, when the party had made camp along a bend in the Platte, she noticed a group of men huddled around the fire with Gideon at the center, talking in low tones and tossing suspicious glances her way. The next morning, the moment arrived with shocking swiftness. Gideon cornered her as she was repacking her few belongings. His voice was cold and certain. "We can't carry you any farther," he said, arms folded across his chest. Dust swirled around his worn boots. "We've lost 2 horses in the last storm. Half our supplies are gone, and the pass ahead is fraught with dangers. I've taken a vote. The men agree. You'll stay behind." She stammered, tears scorching her eyes. "You can't just leave me. My baby, my husband. Please, you must let me continue with the train. I'll work for my keep." Gideon shook his head. "We'll leave you what we can spare. Maybe there's a settlement not far from here, or maybe another train will come along. But we move on at dawn." Charlotte glanced around frantically, but no one would meet her gaze. A few women wore sorrowful expressions, but fear of Gideon's wrath kept them silent. One friend, Margaret, slipped a small cloth pouch of biscuits and dried beans into Charlotte's hands before turning away, tears on her cheeks. So it was settled. The next dawn, while the pale sunlight struggled through the low-slung clouds, the wagon train rolled on without Charlotte. She stood there on trembling legs, the silence broken only by the groan of wheels and the distant bawl of oxen. Her trunk, lightened of anything worth selling, remained by her feet. The group left her a few meager rations, a threadbare blanket, and a single canteen of water. As the dust of their departure rose and drifted, Charlotte pressed her hand to her belly. She felt her child move, as if sensing her peril. "I will survive," she murmured, letting tears fall freely at last. For us both. Hours passed, and Charlotte wandered aimlessly across the plains, scanning the horizon for any sign of settlement. But there was nothing, just rolling prairie and the occasional jagged outcrop of rock. The heat rose in shimmering waves, and though the Platte River ran eastward, a few miles behind her, she dared not return there. To the west, thunderheads gathered their edges, bruised purple and black. If a storm broke over her in the open with no wagon or shelter, she would be soaked and vulnerable. Her mind worked frantically. She needed to find food, water, and some sort of refuge. She had been on the trail for months, but always with the security of others. Setting up and breaking down camp was always a communal effort. Now, truly alone, she realized how little she knew about survival. She wasn't entirely ignorant. Thomas had taught her a few basics. She remembered how to dig a shallow pit line it with heated stones, how to find wild berries or small game. But pregnant and grieving, her confidence warred with despair. At midday, the sun pounded mercilessly, forcing her to stop. She found a boulder that offered a sliver of shade and rested, sipping sparingly from her canteen. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she knew the few biscuits and beans had to be rationed if she wanted to last more than a day or two. The wind whipped dust across her face, and she coughed, tears welling from the grit. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Through the glare, she saw a figure on horseback cresting a rise. She froze, heart pounding. Could it be one of Gideon's men returning out of pity, or was it some unknown traveler, perhaps kind enough to offer help? But as the rider drew nearer, Charlotte's heart jolted anew. She recognized the distinctive buckskins, the sleek hair bound in braids, a Native American man. Fear coiled around her, fueled by rumors and half-truths. She'd heard campfire stories of raids and violence. The wagon train always spoke in hushed, wary tones about hostiles. She pressed herself against the rock, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her heart hammered so loud she was sure he could hear it. Yet he had spotted her already. The rider urged his horse forward, approaching slowly. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as she readied to scramble away, although there was nowhere to run. When he was only a dozen yards off, he halted his mount. She saw a tall man lean with muscle skin browned by endless days in the sun. His expression was unreadable, but not threatening. For a moment, neither spoke nor moved. Finally, in halting English, he asked, "Are you alone?" His voice was surprisingly gentle. Charlotte swallowed hard, not trusting her own voice. Despite her fear, she nodded. He glanced around at the barren land, the scorching sun overhead. "You are lost?" She found her voice cracking. "Yes, I've been abandoned." His gaze flickered to her belly, registering her pregnancy. A slow wave of sympathy softened his features. "No one should be left alone like this," he said quietly. She did not move. Memories of terror-laden wagon train stories about tribal attacks warred with her own sense of decency. He might help her, or he might be leading her into a trap. Either way, she had no option left. She managed to say, "I'm Charlotte." He dismounted, leading his horse by the reins. "White Hawk of the Shawnee." He pointed to the sky. "Storm will come soon." Then he gestured to his horse as though offering her a ride. "You must find shelter." She looked at the imposing horse, then at the swirling storm clouds. Her lips felt cracked and dry. She was terrified, but an even more potent fear. The certainty of death if she remained alone pushed her to accept. Slowly she climbed onto the horse behind him, heart thundering in her chest, her arms slipping around his waist to steady herself. She could feel the tension in his muscles, but also a cautious care. He turned the horse toward the distant rock formations that jutted from the plains. "We go. We try to outrun the storm." As the first low rumble of thunder boomed across the sky, they set off. Charlotte clung to White Hawk, both fearful and relieved. Little did she know this moment, this unlikely partnership, would change her life forever. They rode for what felt like hours, the wind rising, the sky darkening. Lightning slashed across the horizon, illuminating an endless sea of prairie grass. Sheets of rain began to hammer down the drops, cold and sharp against Charlotte's face. White Hawk guided the horse with calm confidence, scanning the terrain until he found a sheltered alcove carved into a rocky cliff. He helped Charlotte dismount, then quickly set about tying the horse under an overhang. Inside the shallow cave, they found respite from the wind and rain. White Hawk gathered dry grasses and small branches, swiftly producing a spark from flint to kindle a fire. Charlotte watched, shivering from both fear and the chill that seeped through her wet dress. The smell of smoke curled warmly in the cramped space, easing some of her dread. They sat in silence for a time, listening to the relentless storm pounding outside. The flickering firelight danced over White Hawk's sharp features, revealing cautious concern in his eyes. She thought of all the warnings she had heard, rumors that tribe members would kill any settler who wandered off alone. Yet here she was, a pregnant woman left to die by her own people, saved by a stranger who was supposed to be her enemy. She rubbed her swollen belly in slow circles, trying to calm the anxious child within. Finally, White Hawk broke the silence. "Why did they leave you?" Charlotte struggled to speak around the knot of sorrow in her throat. "My husband died on the trail. Their leader decided I was a burden. They didn't want to wait for me." A muscle in White Hawk's jaw flexed. He did not immediately reply, but his eyes glimmered with indignation. The concept of leaving a pregnant woman to perish clearly struck him as abhorrent. After a moment, he rummaged through a pouch at his belt and offered her a strip of dried venison. She accepted gratefully, tears pricking her eyes at the simple kindness. The meal was meager, but fortified her weary body. She tried to rest, leaning back against the rocky wall, mindful of the dampness in her clothes. Eventually, she drifted into a fitful sleep, lulled by the fire's warmth and the steady drumming of rain. Though she hardly knew the man beside her, something about his calm presence quelled her terror. In her dreams, she saw a cabin by a sparkling river, the home Thomas had promised. Shadows swirled at the edge of the vision, swirling dust, tumbling wagon wheels, and a baby's cries. She woke with a gasp, hand clutching her belly. White Hawk, who was tending the fire, glanced at her. "Bad dream." She nodded, too drained to speak. Slowly she realized the storm had ended. The first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky outside their small shelter. White Hawk offered her a small flask of water. She sipped, easing the dryness in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." He nodded solemnly, as though acknowledging a shared humanity that transcended the frontier's harsh divides. "You will come with me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Cannot leave you alone." Charlotte was torn. She didn't know what awaited her if she continued west alone, or if she tried to find another wagon train. It was possible she could stumble into a nearby settlement, but from what she'd gleaned on the trail, the next major stop, Fort Laramie, was still a considerable distance away. With her supplies nearly gone, traveling alone spelled disaster. Yet going deeper into unknown territories with a Shawnee warrior she'd just met carried its own uncertainties. Before she could respond, White Hawk added, "I travel north, then east, near the big waters of the Missouri. My people, some are there, but the way is long." He glanced at her belly once more. "Can you ride?" Charlotte exhaled, weighing the odds. She had no illusions about how harsh the West could be, and she had glimpsed White Hawk's decency. "I don't have many choices," she said softly. "I'll go with you, if you'll have me." White Hawk gave a single curt nod. "We leave soon." Thus her new path was decided, shaped by necessity and a stranger's benevolence. The pregnant widow turned her back on the wagon ruts that had brought her this far, stepping into a future she never imagined. In the days that followed, Charlotte adjusted to life on horseback with White Hawk. They traveled quietly across the plains, skirting settlements and moving through valleys and bluffs to avoid attention. White Hawk hunted small game and showed Charlotte how to ration and prepare food, though her body, pregnant and grieving, tired quickly. At night they camped under stars, speaking little, but learning to trust each other. White Hawk occasionally shared stories of his displaced tribe and lost family, while Charlotte opened up about Thomas, her dreams and fears for her unborn child. A quiet understanding grew between them as they neared the North Platte River and Fort Laramie. Charlotte's health began to falter, her ankle-swollen dizziness slowing their pace. Though she longed for the safety of the fort, White Hawk warned of danger. Tensions between settlers and native people were high. Deciding it was too risky, he went to trade on the outskirts under cover of dusk. Charlotte waited unsure and vulnerable, but trusting that he'd return. At dawn, hidden among the willows near Fort Laramie, Charlotte watched anxiously as White Hawk approached a lone fur trapper. In exchange for some supplies, White Hawk quietly negotiated for medicine and a blanket. But before the deal was complete, a group of soldiers appeared nearby. Sensing danger, White Hawk quickly backed away. The trapper, sensing tension, distracted the soldiers just long enough for White Hawk to vanish into the tall grass. He returned to Charlotte, moments later, breathless but unharmed, clutching the needed supplies. "We have to move," he said quietly. They slipped away from the fort's reach, staying low and alert. Later, Charlotte was overwhelmed by his courage and kindness. The bundle contained medicinal herbs and a coarse wool blanket. Simple things, but precious in their situation. Though weary and increasingly burdened by her pregnancy, she found strength in White Hawk's steady presence. One late afternoon, the travelers camped by a narrow creek winding through a shallow ravine. Tall cottonwoods provided shade, and the earth was soft enough for Charlotte to sit comfortably. She dozed in the warm twilight as White Hawk scouted a short distance away, hoping to gather more wood for a fire. The wind was still, the sky ablaze with the oranges and purples of sunset. Suddenly, a sharp hiss sliced the silence. Charlotte jolted awake, eyes widening as an arrow quivered in the trunk of a cottonwood beside her. Fear tightened her chest. She frantically looked around, but saw no one, just shifting shadows among the trees. She tried to stand, panic surging. In a rush of movement, White Hawk appeared, sprinting toward her. "Stay down," he hissed, eyes scanning the tree line. A second arrow thunked into the ground a few feet away. White Hawk dropped into a crouch next to Charlotte, bow in hand. Quickly, he notched an arrow, pulling the string taut, scanning for their attackers. He fired into the trees, and a cry echoed back. Figures darted in the dusk, maybe 3 or 4 men moving swiftly. Charlotte could not identify them, but from their war cries they were not friendly. White Hawk signaled for her to crawl behind a fallen log. Trembling, she obeyed, clutching her belly. Her heart hammered so loudly she thought it might burst. The next minutes were a blur of terror. Arrows whizzed through the air, some embedding in the log. White Hawk fired back, each shot carefully chosen. He moved with lightning reflexes, rolling away from the trunk and loosing arrow after arrow. The night exploded into primal chaos, the thunder of blood pounding in Charlotte's ears. She prayed they would survive. Gradually the hail of arrows ceased. A hush fell. White Hawk stood poised, bow ready, eyes piercing the darkening forest. Then footsteps retreated, a scuffling sound fading into the distance. Whoever attacked them had fled. White Hawk approached Charlotte. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her entire body trembling. "I'm all right." Tears spilled down her cheeks as adrenaline crashed. "Who were they?" He pressed his lips together. Could be Lakota or Cheyenne, or just raiders. Not every group wants peace. Some want revenge, or they see us as easy prey. Her chest tightened at the mention of tribes warring with each other as well as with settlers. She realized how naive it had been to assume White Hawk wouldn't face danger from his own people or from other nations just because he was native. The West was a patchwork of alliances and vendettas, especially with the influx of settlers, spurring new conflicts over land. "We must move," he said softly. "They might return with more men." "Are you strong enough to ride?" She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her pregnancy and the exhaustion in her limbs. But fear of staying overcame her fatigue. "Yes," she croaked. They quickly packed their sparse belongings, White Hawk glancing around warily all the while. The remains of the arrows and their assailants' footprints vanished in the dusk. With haste he helped her onto his horse. They rode away into the deepening night, hoping the attackers would not follow. Days later, they found a small canyon to shelter in. The red rock walls glowed under the sun, and a narrow stream threaded through its base, providing fresh water. The place felt remote, far from any trails. Here they rested, letting Charlotte recover from the constant stress of travel. She found respite in the canyon's natural enclosure, the high walls blocking wind and prying eyes. One evening, while collecting more wood, White Hawk returned with grim news. He found fresh tracks at the canyon's entrance, horse tracks possibly belonging to a small band. He feared the same attackers, or another group, might be scouting the area. They had little choice but to remain hidden for as long as Charlotte's body demanded rest. If forced to flee, she might go into labor under dire circumstances. Anxious Charlotte asked, "What if they come for us? We can't fight them alone, especially if the baby comes soon." White Hawk's brow furrowed. "I will protect you," he said firmly, "but we must be ready to move at any time." She nodded, grateful yet scared. In that moment, she realized how deeply she trusted this man more than she'd ever thought possible. Without him, she would likely have perished days ago. Despite their stark differences in language and culture, they stood together, two exiles, finding solace in each other's company. As the evening deepened, White Hawk showed her how to hold and notch an arrow on his spare bow. "If something happens, you must try," he said, positioning her hands. She trembled, but forced herself to learn. Her arms quivered with the effort of drawing back the string, and her belly felt heavy. Yet White Hawk's patience never wavered. He guided her movements until she managed a rudimentary shot. "Good," he said, nodding with approval. "Your child will have a strong mother." His words moved her to tears. She felt a surge of pride and determination. The West was ruthless, but she refused to be a victim anymore. In the dark of night, as a full moon bathed the canyon walls in pale light, Charlotte's contractions began. At first, the pains were subtle, reminiscent of the false alarms she'd experienced days before. But soon they intensified, rolling through her in waves that stole her breath. Her body trembled with the effort. White Hawk sprang into action, gathering water-heating stones and arranging the new blanket. He'd witnessed births in his tribe, had even assisted midwives. Though not an expert, he had a better grasp than Charlotte expected. She surrendered to his instructions, focusing on each breath, each surge of pain. Hours passed in agonizing struggle. Charlotte felt time blur, existing in a realm of pure sensation, fear, hope, pain, and exhaustion. She cried out, tears mingling with sweat. White Hawk clasped her hand, whispering words in Shawnee she did not understand, but felt all the same comforting her, urging her on. At last, near dawn, a sharp cry pierced the canyon's stillness. The sound reverberated off the red walls like a triumphant chorus. Charlotte gasped in relief as her child, her son, slipped into White Hawk's waiting arms. The baby's cries were strong, announcing his arrival to the silent desert. Tears blinded Charlotte. She reached out, and White Hawk carefully placed the newborn in her trembling arms. Utter wonder filled her as she counted tiny fingers and toes, felt the delicate warmth of his skin. She pressed him to her chest, heart overflowing with gratitude and awe. "You did it," White Hawk said, voice trembling with quiet emotion. He wrapped them both in the blanket, ensuring the baby stayed warm against the chill air. For a time, Charlotte simply wept and murmured lullabies to her son. In that raw moment, she realized how precarious life was, that her child existed at all. Healthy on this wild frontier was nothing short of a miracle. She looked at White Hawk, tears still streaming. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved us." He placed a gentle hand on the baby's head, a smile softening his usually stoic features. "Welcome to the world, little one." In the wake of the baby's birth, Charlotte and White Hawk spent 2 weeks recovering in the canyon. Each day she gained strength nourished by the game White Hawk hunted and by the water from the stream. She marveled at her son's every movement, every tiny hiccup. She named him James after her father and discovered he had an insatiable appetite and a robust cry. White Hawk crafted a rudimentary cradle board from woven willow branches and softened leather to carry James when they would eventually travel again. Charlotte felt safer than she had in weeks, a deep sense of peace settling upon the canyon. She dared to hope they might remain there longer, forging a quiet existence. But fate had other plans. Late one afternoon, as she lay beside the stream, with James White Hawk, appeared at her side, tense and urgent. "Riders coming," he said quietly, pointing toward the canyon's entrance. "We must hide. Now." Heart-clenching, Charlotte hastily gathered James into her arms, following White Hawk to a rocky niche high on the canyon wall. He'd prepared it before, in case they needed refuge. From there, they had a vantage point over the canyon floor. Seconds later, the sound of hooves echoed. A band of 4 men on horseback emerged, 2 white men and 2 men who appeared native but from a different tribe, or possibly just hired trackers. Charlotte's stomach churned. One of the white men wore a wide-brimmed hat dusted with travel. The other had a distinctive red beard. Something about them seemed oddly familiar. White Hawk watched them intently, bow in hand, but his expression darkened with suspicion. The riders dismounted, scanning the ground. A scrawny man with a notched rifle prodded the earth. They were here all right. "Prints are fresh." Charlotte's blood turned cold at the realization that these men were deliberately tracking them. White Hawk's posture suggested he recognized danger. She tried to keep James quiet, praying he wouldn't cry. The red-bearded man spat on the ground. "Well, we find him soon enough. This is the only real place to shelter for miles. Check those rocks. The woman can't be far. Gideon'll pay good if we bring her back. Or at least her trunk. Heard she had some valuables." Gideon. Charlotte felt a rush of anger and fear. Her wagon train's leader, the man who abandoned her, was apparently looking for her again, but only for her belongings. Perhaps word reached him that she'd survived. Or maybe he simply wanted to ensure she wasn't a liability who could speak against him. The motives hardly mattered. The threat was real and immediate. The men spread out. White Hawk motioned for Charlotte to keep low, his every muscle coiled in readiness. If the riders climbed too high, they would find them. Charlotte's heart thundered. She glanced at James, who stirred in her arms, but miraculously stayed silent. Minutes crawled by. The men searched the canyon floor, rummaging through the remains of the fire pit, but they didn't immediately look up the sheer walls. One of the native trackers muttered something, pointing toward footprints leading into the creek. Another suggested the pair might have followed the stream out of the canyon. Eventually the men mounted up again, galloping deeper into the gorge, presumably to search the far end. Only when the echo of hooves faded did White Hawk exhale. Charlotte felt sweat trickle down her spine, relief flooding her. But their sanctuary was compromised. It was only a matter of time before Gideon's hired men swept back. Night fell, and the pair debated whether to stay or attempt to flee the canyon under cover of darkness. White Hawk insisted they couldn't remain. If Gideon's men returned in greater numbers or realized they might be hiding in the rocky niches, Charlotte and James would be in grave peril. "We travel by night," he said. "I will lead the horse carefully. You hold James. We keep to the shadows." Though terrified, Charlotte agreed. She trusted White Hawk's instincts. So under a pale moon, they gathered their modest supplies, saddled the roan horse, and slipped away. The canyon seemed alive with shifting silhouettes, every rock formation casting a stark, ghostly shape. They kept lights extinguished, relying on White Hawk's keen senses and the moon's faint glow to guide them through the winding passages. Now and again, the roan snorted nervously, picking its way over rocky ground. Charlotte clutched James protectively, whispering soothing words when he stirred. Every rustle of wind in the crevices made her start. She imagined Gideon's men lurking behind every boulder. After what felt like endless hours, the canyon walls receded opening onto rolling foothills. Dawn would soon break. Exhausted yet relieved, Charlotte sank against White Hawk, who pressed a reassuring hand to her shoulder. But the respite was short-lived. A distant shout rang out. Turning, they saw a flicker of movement behind them. In the pre-dawn light, a small band of riders charged out of the canyon exit, raising a cloud of dust. The same men or reinforcements. Either way, they had found the trail. White Hawk shouted for Charlotte to hold tight. He spurred the roan into a gallop, racing across the uneven hills. Charlotte clung to his waist arms locked around James. The baby began to wail as the horse bounded over rough terrain. Gunshots cracked the morning air, bullets whizzing overhead. Fear flooded Charlotte's veins. She hunched over James as if her body could shield him. White Hawk leaned low, urging every ounce of speed from the roan. The pounding of hooves and the ragged breath of their pursuers filled the world with a dizzying cacophony. Gradually the pursuers fell behind. The roan, nimble and well-fed, outpaced the heavier horses, weighed down by multiple riders. As the sun's first rays lanced across the sky, White Hawk led them down into a shallow ravine, doubling back to confuse the pursuers. By the time they dared pause, Charlotte's lungs burned, and her eyes stung with tears. White Hawk dismounted, scanning the horizon. The riders were nowhere in sight. He helped Charlotte slide off the horse, supporting her trembling body. James bawled, his face red, and Charlotte tried to calm him. Tears glistened in her own eyes. "It's over," White Hawk said softly, though tension lingered in his every word. "We lost them. For now." Charlotte held James close, the baby's cries gradually subsiding against her heartbeat. She looked up at White Hawk, struggling to convey her gratitude and relief. "Thank you," she whispered, voice shaking. "You saved us again." He touched her shoulder gently. "I said I would protect you." Several days later, they found themselves following a winding river through a wide valley. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow even in summer. Here the grass was lush and green deer and buffalo grazing in the distance. White Hawk hoped to circle south and eventually reach safer territories where fewer settlers roamed, and Gideon's men were unlikely to track them. They rose at dawn, preparing to continue their journey. Charlotte felt renewed by the crisp morning air. She fed James and carefully checked their supplies. White Hawk was out gathering more firewood for breakfast. Suddenly, a lone rider approached from the east. Charlotte tensed, glancing around for White Hawk, but he was still out of sight. She considered taking up the bow, but remembered she was no marksman. Instead, she held James close, heart hammering. The rider slowed as he neared, raising a hand in greeting. It was a middle-aged man, with greying hair and dusty clothes. He looked like a drifter or prospector. "Mornin'," he called, voice echoing in the stillness. "I don't mean no harm, ma'am. Just saw your camp." Charlotte swallowed, wary. "Good morning," she replied, forcing calm. He dismounted, leading his horse closer, but still keeping a respectful distance. "You're traveling alone out here. Looks dangerous for a woman with a newborn." She shook her head, choosing her words carefully. "I'm with a friend. He'll be back soon." The man nodded. "Ah. Well, I'm James Turnbull, heading west to try my luck in the mines. Always keep an eye out for folks who might need help, or maybe want to trade." Charlotte's tension eased slightly. He didn't look like one of Gideon's men. Still, she remained cautious. "I'm Charlotte. We're just passing through." He scanned the small camp, seeming genuinely curious, not overtly hostile. "You from a wagon train?" She bit her lip. "I was. They left me behind." Anger flickered in his eyes. "That's cruel." Then he tilted his head, noticing James's tiny form. "And with a baby, no less. I swear some folks got no souls." Before Charlotte could respond, White Hawk emerged from the trees, carrying an armful of sticks. He froze upon seeing Turnbull body, tensing eyes sharp. Slowly he approached, setting the wood down. Turnbull raised a hand again in what seemed like genuine peace. "Evening or morning, I should say. I'm not here to cause trouble." White Hawk regarded him silently for a moment, then glanced at Charlotte, a silent question in his gaze. She nodded slightly, indicating it was okay. "I'm White Hawk," he said softly. Turnbull took off his hat. "Pleased to meet you. I got no quarrel with the tribes or with folks living free out here." He paused. "Let me guess, some wagon train folks giving you two trouble." White Hawk's jaw tightened. Charlotte noticed how rare it was for him to speak with strangers, especially white men. "Yes," he said simply. Turnbull spat on the ground. "Figured as much. This land's full of scoundrels. The army doesn't do much but protect them big outfits heading to Oregon or California. Smaller folks like us, well, we fend for ourselves." He rummaged in his saddlebag. Charlotte stiffened, but he only withdrew a small pouch of coffee grounds. "Here," he offered. "I got more than I need. Take it if you like." White Hawk glanced at Charlotte, who seemed torn. She and Thomas had once shared a love of coffee in the mornings. She nodded, allowing Turnbull to pass the pouch. White Hawk accepted it wordlessly. After exchanging a bit more conversation, Turnbull tipped his hat. "I'll be on my way. If you're heading west, keep your eyes peeled. Word is there's an unsavory group collecting bounties on folks that break from wagon trains. I'd steer clear of 'em." He mounted his horse and rode off at a casual pace, leaving Charlotte and White Hawk in an uneasy calm. The coffee was a small comfort, a sign that not every stranger on the frontier was an enemy. Still, Turnbull's warning echoed in Charlotte's mind. A bounty. Perhaps Gideon had placed a price on her head, or something equally sinister. She turned to White Hawk. "We have to keep moving." He nodded. "Yes." "No time to waste." They continued west, and the days melted together in a haze of sun-scorched prairies, winding streams and star-filled nights. Charlotte marveled at the strange beauty of the land, the brilliant swathes of wildflowers that dotted the plains, the herds of buffalo that rumbled across the horizon. She thought about how little she truly understood of the West when she first set out on that wagon train. Now she had been forged by it, shaped by trials she never imagined. At times the weariness was overwhelming. James woke often at night crying for milk. Charlotte nursed him, rocking him gently beneath the moonlight. Her mind drifted to Thomas, to the dream they once shared. How different her world was now. Yet she felt a stirring of renewed hope, an inkling of gratitude that she was still alive, forging a new path for her son. All the while, White Hawk remained her steadfast protector. He hunted for them, guided them across treacherous terrain, found water, scouted any sign of pursuers. A profound bond had formed between them, something built on mutual survival and respect. One evening as they sat by a crackling fire, Charlotte mentioned how she wished she could repay him. He looked at her brow creasing. "You keep your child safe," he said. "That is enough." Sometimes Charlotte caught him watching James with a gentle expression, as though reminded of a life that had been taken from him. She had never asked him if he'd lost a child or if he had family left. It felt too personal. But she sensed a shared grief in his eyes, the weight of heartbreak that had brought them together on this improbable journey. Clouds gathered in the west one evening, heavy and slate-grey. White Hawk frowned. "Big storm coming," he said. "We need shelter." They found a grove of cottonwoods near a swollen stream. As thunder rumbled overhead, they made a hasty camp. Charlotte used the last of the coffee Turnbull had given them. She savoured its bitter warmth, recalling simpler times. Lightning flashed wind whipping through the trees. Rain cascaded in sheets, forcing them under the roan's canvas and a makeshift lean-to. White Hawk wrapped James in buffalo hide to keep him dry, while Charlotte clung to him tightly. The thunder boomed like cannon fire, shaking the ground. Despite the raging storm, a sense of strange security enveloped Charlotte. She and James were not alone in the world. They had White Hawk, an unlikely guardian, a friend. Another test of nature howled around them, but they faced it together. When the storm cleared, the landscape glistened under the fresh morning sun. The air smelled of wet earth and possibility. White Hawk decided they would cross a broad plain toward a distant ridge, hoping to find a more permanent camp or discover a settlement that wasn't hostile to him or Charlotte. They rode at an easy pace, James snugly tucked in the cradleboard against Charlotte's chest. Over weeks of traveling, she had grown adept at balancing him while on horseback, guided by White Hawk's steady instructions. By midday, the ridge loomed rocky slopes peppered with pine. Suddenly, White Hawk reined in the horse eyes, scanning the horizon. Charlotte followed his gaze and felt her heart drop. A group of riders stood silhouetted at the crest, a half-dozen men at least. One raised a rifle pointing down at them. They had been ambushed. Gunfire cracked. The bullet kicked up dust mere yards away. White Hawk cursed and wheeled the roan around. Charlotte clutched James, terror pounding in her veins. More shots rang out, chasing them as they galloped back the way they came. But a second band of riders erupted from behind a copse of trees, blocking their escape. Charlotte recognized the red beard among them. Gideon's men had multiplied, boxing them in. White Hawk slid from the saddle, helping Charlotte dismount quickly behind a jagged rock outcrop. She shielded James with her body as he pulled his bow. Shots ricocheted off rocks whizzing overhead. White Hawk returned fire, with arrows felling one rider who toppled from his horse with a scream. The world spun into chaos, men shouting guns, blazing the roan, neighing in panic. Charlotte's fear was electric, but she forced herself to stay low. James pressed to her chest. In a lull of gunfire, a chilling voice called out, "Charlotte, it's Gideon. Come out now, or I'll burn you out." She peered around the rock. Gideon sat astride a horse a short distance away, rifle in hand. His expression was hard as flint. "I gave you a chance to vanish, but you had to stick around, didn't you? Well, your trunk of valuables is worth a pretty penny. Hand it over, and maybe I'll let you live." Charlotte's fury erupted. "You left me to die. You killed my husband, as surely as if you pushed him under the wagon." She knew the accident wasn't Gideon's direct doing, but in her heart she blamed him for the pitiless drive that caused so many dangers. Gideon sneered, motioning to his men to spread out. White Hawk fired an arrow, forcing them to duck behind their horses. Tension crackled. One of the men tried to circle around. White Hawk dropped him with a single shot to the shoulder, and he howled, slipping from the saddle. Over the crying baby, Charlotte heard Gideon cursing. Then Gideon bellowed, "I'll give you one last chance, Charlotte. Send out that savage, or we'll rid you of him ourselves. Then you and your brat can come back to the train. Might be, we'll show some mercy." Rage flared in Charlotte like a bonfire. "You call that mercy?" she shouted back. "I have a family now, something you know nothing about." She locked eyes with White Hawk, whose expression was grim yet resolute. They had come too far to surrender now. The final battle erupted. Bullets chipped the rocks, dust billowed. White Hawk used every arrow with lethal precision, but Gideon's men still pressed closer, outnumbering him. Charlotte realized with horror that they might be overrun. She refused to let them take James. Terror and resolve fueled her, and she recalled White Hawk's lessons. The small bow lay within reach. Hands shaking, she notched an arrow, clumsily drawing the string back. She peered around the rock, spotted a rider reloading his rifle. Her breath caught. She released the arrow. It flew wide, grazing the man's arm. He yelled in pain, dropping the rifle. A wave of shock and savage triumph rippled through Charlotte. White Hawk's final arrow took out another attacker. Now Gideon was left with only one uninjured man, the rest scattered or wounded. Realizing the tide had turned, Gideon cursed. He raised his rifle, aiming squarely at Charlotte. She froze the bow, useless in her trembling hands now. A shot rang out, but it wasn't Gideon's rifle. A new figure emerged from behind Gideon, firing a revolver that struck Gideon's arm. Gideon roared in agony, his rifle spinning away as blood stained his sleeve. He slumped in the saddle before toppling to the ground, cursing. Charlotte blinked in shock as the new figure became visible. It was James Turnbull, the prospector they'd met days ago. He hollered, "Thought you could use a hand." White Hawk was already running to Gideon's side, kicking away the rifle. Gideon's remaining cohort, seeing his leader wounded, bolted and galloped off in terror. Gideon glared up at White Hawk, hatred burning in his eyes. He clutched his bleeding arm, powerless. "You'll regret crossing me," he spat, face twisted in pain. White Hawk leveled an arrow at Gideon's chest. Charlotte approached, breath ragged. She gazed at Gideon, the man who had sealed her fate weeks ago. Now their roles were reversed. She held power over his life. Turnbull joined them, rifle still smoking. "Pairs, you folks got a decision to make," he said, quietly. Gideon groaned, sweat beading on his brow. Fear flickered behind his scowl. "You can't kill me, Charlotte," he rasped. I'm all you got left. I'm the only one who can get you to civilization." Charlotte's body trembled with rage, sorrow, and a strange pity. She glanced at Whitehawk, who waited for her word. Then she spoke, voice steady. "I have all I need." She paused, considering. Killing Gideon in cold blood would stain her soul. "We'll leave you a horse. You can ride out and find help, but never come near my family again." Gideon spat pain, twisting his features, but he recognized her resolve. He gave a curt nod, forced by circumstances. Whitehawk lowered his bow. Turnbull retrieved a horse for Gideon, though Gideon could hardly mount alone. Swallowing humiliation, Gideon clambered up, cradling his wounded arm. He shot Charlotte a venomous look. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Then he spurred the horse and disappeared into the dust. In the aftermath, Charlotte's knees buckled. Whitehawk caught her, helping her to a seat on a flat rock. James wailed, sensing her tension. She rocked him, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It's over," she whispered, hardly believing it. Turnbull scratched his chin. "I was trailing them for a while. Overheard talk about a bounty for you folks. Reckoned you could use a friendly trigger." "So, what now?" Whitehawk looked to Charlotte. She gazed at the broad horizon, new possibilities unfolding. "We keep going," she said finally. "We find a place where James can grow up safe, where we can live in peace." Turnbull nodded. "I might know a settlement up north. They ain't too fond of Gideon's brand of folk. I could lead you part way at least." Whitehawk and Charlotte shared a glance. A new direction, a new hope. Through tears, Charlotte smiled. "Yes, let's find our own path." They journeyed together toward a small settlement, rumored to be more open-minded about travelers, white, native, or otherwise. On the way, Turnbull parted ways, heading back to chase his fortune in the mines. He left them with a few supplies and a tip of his hat. Whitehawk and Charlotte pressed on, forging a bond that went deeper than words. By the time they sighted the modest settlement tucked against the rolling hills, Charlotte felt relief and a pang of nervousness. Would they be welcomed or shunned? She worried for Whitehawk, who had risked everything to keep her safe. But as they rode into the settlement, a scattering of cabins and tents around a crystal-clear creek, no one raised a gun. A few curious faces peered out. Children giggled at the sight of the roan. An older woman approached, offering a basket of bread. "You look half-starved, dear," she said, ignoring the fact that a Shawnee man accompanied Charlotte. It was the most normal greeting Charlotte had received in months. Weeks turned into months. Charlotte and Whitehawk found a small cabin to rent, left behind by a prospector who'd moved on. With the settlement's acceptance, Whitehawk could hunt and trade freely, while Charlotte cared for James and contributed by sewing and cooking for neighbors in exchange for staples. The baby thrived, cooing in the cradle board that Whitehawk had lovingly crafted. There were challenges. Suspicion still lived in some corners of the settlement, whispers about the Indian. But Whitehawk's quiet kindness gradually won over most folks. Charlotte often recalled Gideon's parting threat, wondering if he would return, but he never did. Word had it, he left the territory or nursed his wounded arm in some far-off place, shamed by his defeat. Slowly, Charlotte found a measure of peace. Though she would always mourn Thomas, she knew life moved forward. She saw James grin at White Hawk, his tiny hands reaching for him. In those moments, she felt the bond they shared, two souls who had been cast adrift in the savage frontier, only to find each other. She remembered the canyon, the storms, the endless plains, the day she nearly died alone. And she thought of how fate led her to a Shawnee warrior who changed her destiny, teaching her that there is kindness and courage in the most unexpected places. At dusk, she stood outside their small cabin, cradling James in her arms as the sun slipped behind the hills. White Hawk joined her, quiet as always, though his presence spoke volumes. They watched the sky burn with orange and pink. Charlotte pressed her cheek to James's downy head, love flooding her heart. "Tomorrow, we'll see what new wonders this land holds," she whispered. White Hawk met her gaze, a gentle smile forming. "Yes," he said. "Tomorrow." And as the night sky spread its blanket of stars, Charlotte felt certain of one thing. They had survived not just to exist, but to truly live, forging a path that was both theirs to share. Thank you for taking this journey across the rugged plains and hidden canyons of the Old West, a place where one woman's will to survive brought her face to face with unexpected allies and changed her destiny forever. In Pregnant Woman, thrown off a wagon train, rescued by a Shawnee warrior who changed her fate. We've witnessed Charlotte's resilience and the power of compassion that defied every boundary the frontier tried to set. If this story gripped your heart, please show your support by hitting the like button. Share it with friends and family who love tales of survival courage and the human spirit. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more immersive stories that transport you to different times and places. Your support helps us continue bringing such adventures to life, so together we can keep the spirit of storytelling alive for generations to come.